Progressivism is a societal cancer. Oh, hi there, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Islam and its relationship with the far left. Now, it's blatantly obvious for anyone with two brain cells to rub together that the far left and increasingly the mainstream left wing, both in Europe and North America, is increasingly sympathetic to mass Islamic immigration. Now, many people still wonder why is that the case, since Islam, if anything, is even more politically incorrect than even the harshest versions of Christianity, at least the versions that we've seen play out in Europe and in North America in the last 500 years. Not to mention that, many people who criticize Islam, or as I like to call them, Islamo-critics, base their position on fundamentally leftist positions, such as the fact that Islam is not exactly a friend of gender equality, or the fact that Islam tends to take a dim view of non-straight people. Now, as an Islamo-critic myself, I care more about the dim view that Islam takes on free speech and bodily autonomy, but regardless of one's position on the political spectrum, there are numerous problems with Islam, and although Islamo-critics on the left are a bit afraid to admit it, most people can indeed agree that Islam is indeed incompatible with the European way of life. Now, since several of you, the subscribers of this channel, have asked me to make a video specifically about the British left and Islam, I'll honor this request and use examples mostly from Britain, but what I'm about to say in this video applies pretty much everywhere in Europe. So anyway, buckle up, because this is going to be a bit long, I think. Anyway, to understand why things are the way they are, one needs first to understand the left and the history of the last 50 or so years. Traditionally, the left wing in Western Europe was about union rights, workers' rights, and generally anything that was anti-business and supposedly in favor of the common man. Now, as much as of an anti-leftist as I am, I can surely agree that a significant portion of the average left-wingers are well-intended. They just happen to be wrong, but they're well-intended. So anyway, as unbelievable as it sounds today, for instance, the Labour Party's selling point in Britain was that it was the party of the common man. Now, that slogan would be derided today as sexist by the likes of Harriet Harman, or Harriet Herperson, or Yvette Cooper, or any one of the modern left wing. But in the past, it was actually the main selling point. The problem is that as time went on, people, and by people I mean all people, have gotten wealthier. In Britain, the Labour had a huge shot at governing the place, and it governed it so well that it turned the place into a hellhole. Few people know this today, but the per capita economic output in Labour-led Britain in late 70s was just marginally better than communist Hungary. And Hungary was fucking broke at that time, because soon after the late 70s, the Qatar regime was actually forced to make pro-market reforms in order to avoid complete collapse. One of the reasons why Ceausescu, for instance, was received with full honors in 1978 in Britain was not because the Brits liked Ceausescu, of course they didn't like him, but because the state was so broke that they were willing to do anything to bring a bit more business and prevent the total collapse. So Britain was a bit behind the curve because, for instance, France at the same time in late 70s was booming and most of Europe was already getting better. But then, the Labour have lost popularity, and then Britain got Margaret Thatcher and not only caught up with the rest of Europe, but by the end of Thatcher's rule, Britain had outpaced the rest of Europe, both West and East, by quite far margins. Paradoxically for the left, or normally for the rest of the people, the so-called working class was not only wealthier, but got significantly wealthier, especially throughout the 80s. So by early 1990s, the working class was more prosperous than ever, more educated than ever, and essentially became bourgeois in the classical Marxist sense. There are even records from within the Labour Party that were acknowledging in the early 1990s that they simply could no longer go to the electorate with the same old story because now the poor usually had one or two cars, owned their houses, were more literate than ever, and thus less likely to take the bait of divisive Marxism any longer. This was partly the reason for which the so-called New Labour was launched, which essentially no longer advocated for the abolition of capitalism and conceded that many of its past policies, were downright wrong. However, that doesn't mean that the left renounced these objectives. It just means that they had to take another route. And you see, with the now bourgeoisie working class, the core objectives of the left were quite irrelevant, especially for the working class. So in order to justify its existence, the left needed a new class of oppressed that it needed to protect. To put it more cynically, in order to continue its fight against the Western civilization, the left needed new people behind whom it could hide and continue the Marxist struggle. But for that, the left also needed votes, and not just a few votes, but lots of them. And gays and ugly feminists could not provide these votes because feminists don't really reproduce, and gays even less so. However, Muslims do tend to reproduce, and they do so at very high rates, as at this moment like 8 times more than the average Westerner. So say hello to multiculturalism, one of the many progressive words under which votes for the left have been bought with taxpayers' money from the most exotic places on the planet in order to replace the sinful and the bourgeoisie proletariat. As events unfolded, most of these new oppressed came from the culture that is the hardest to integrate into Europe, that is to say, Islam. And this is not something that I'm pulling out of my arse here, it's not speculation. Andrew Neither, a former advisor to Tony Blair, said quite clearly and unequivocally that the Labour's relaxation of controls was a deliberate plan to open up the UK to mass immigration. And the ministers at the time were nervous and reluctant to discuss such a move publicly for fear that it would alienate its core working class vote. In other words, the left knew damn well that not even their base would accept such thing. But the base only learned much later, although some of them haven't learned even today, that the working class was to be replaced with the new proletariat, since the ivory tower progressive elites hates the working class more than the most harsh capitalist. Because, you see, the harsh capitalist, whether he likes the working class or not, knows that the market compels him to need them. The left, however, can avoid the market by just bringing in more oppressed. Also, the working class tends to be white and tends to be socially conservative for the most part, and tends to value manhood and womanhood over social constructivist progressive tosh, and the working class also tends to like prosperity over environmental bullshit, and many other things that are fundamentally unprogressive. They do occur in working class circles. In other words, the working class tends to be reactionary rather than progressive. Now, some of you may say that the new proletariat is also reactionary and unprogressive, and you would be correct. But the new proletariat can be, and indeed is, literally bought with taxpayers' money. So for years and years, and in some countries for decades, the new proletariat has indeed been bought, a policy which encouraged ghettoization, especially when combined with progressive doublethink. For instance, expecting an immigrant to learn the language and fully embrace the laws and customs of the land is cultural appropriation and cultural chauvinism. Pointing out the flaws in this line of thinking is actually downright racism. Welcome to the brave new world. And so this also worked because Westerners are also fucking afraid of being called racists, that they do anything to avoid it, including taking orders from the progressives, which are the real racists, as they hate white people so much that they can't stop thinking of new ways to push the whites out of mainstream society. Now, the problem with these policies are as obvious as they can get. Well, obvious to us, not so obvious to the left. You see, multiculturalism evolved simultaneously into essentially 2 parallel universes. One of the universes is the imaginary universe from the academe, the governments, the European Parliament, and the cathedral media. The second universe, also known as, well, reality, is the one we can all see on the streets of European cities who tend to resemble more and more with Kabul or Islamabad. But since we're dealing with leftists, to these people reality is just a social construct. If things go otherwise than what the progressive theory says, then reality must be wrong. Reality has to be a white imperialist cishet capitalist construction that oppresses minorities. The theory can't be wrong. This second universe, the reality that is, also has a few other politically incorrect characteristics, such as the fact that reality has a reactionary bias. Reality tends to be stubborn and unpersuaded by the madness that comes out from the self-proclaimed progressive elite. And, while I offered examples from Britain, this applies to the left in any other European country. In France, for instance, things have gone on for much longer than in Britain, and the only tangible result is, well, the banlieues. The banlieues are essentially areas within France where French law and culture doesn't apply. The leftist, the bias towards mass Islamic immigration applies in Eastern Europe too. With this invasion that's going on these days, the only supporters in here are on the left. Although they try to tone it down a bit because, you see, in Eastern Europe, progressive bullshit is smelled much faster than in the West because we already know from personal experience how a totalitarian monster really looks like. And, what doesn't kill you tends to make you stronger. In Eastern Europe, even the poorest of the poor, the traditional voters of the left, still do oppose mass Islamic immigration. And not only that, but they tend to be far less civil about their position. And just like in the 80s in Britain, the working class in Eastern Europe is also now more bourgeois than ever. The working class in Eastern Europe tends to have 2 cell phones, it tends to own its house, it has fast internet, faster than in the West actually, and freer, and increasingly can afford vacations abroad, and most of them don't have cars because of choice or because they can't afford it. So yeah, this is why the left tends to be friendly with Islam. Besides, when you get down to it, the real disagreements between the left and Islam aren't really as big as they would seem at the first glance. Seriously, think about it a little bit. Both Islam and the left are anti-porn. Both are pro-handouts from the state. Both agree on the sexual objectification of women, though they do differ on methods when it comes to addressing it. They both agree that the average white needs to repent or be expelled from society, although again they differ on methods a little bit. Both hate the Jews and the state of Israel. Both champion sexual segregation, and so on and so forth. You see, there's quite a lot of agreement if you're really comparing apples and apples. That is to say, to compare hardcore, influential leftist ideologues with, well, genuine Islam. Now, I'd have more to say, especially on how many right-wing Islamic critics don't fully understand Islam, or they don't pay attention to details and end up swallowing left-wing propaganda, but, I'll leave that for other videos. So yeah, that's pretty much essentially why the left is in bed with mass Islamic immigration and Islamist apologia. Because, this thing brings votes and it brings power. Will this model last? Probably not. Because, on the long run, they'll either be swept away by the new caliphate, that will be the worst possible outcome, or they'll be compelled to abandon the model if they still want to be voted, as the common man gets sick and tired of all this nonsense. Either way, you should expect the left to come up with a new proletariat in, let's say, 20 or so years. It's what they do. Once in 30 or 40 years, the left changes the proletariat. It was the peasants at first, then the factory workers, now the immigrants. We'll see what they'll come up with the next time around. That is, if there will still be a left wing by that time. So yeah, this is essentially the short version on why the far left is in bed with mass Islamic immigration. It's really a cynical story when you think about it, but, it's the shortest way to explain it. Anyway, talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching.